The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of my Denver apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. At 30, I had everything I thought would make my mother proud: a successful marketing consultancy, a beautiful home in the trendy Reno district, and a client list that included some of Colorado's biggest companies. Yet, as I stared at my phone, hesitating before making my weekly call to Mom, that familiar knot formed in my stomach. "Sarah, honey, is that you?" Her voice carried that familiar tone, not quite warm, but not entirely cold either. It was the voice of someone perpetually measuring, always calculating whether I was worth her time. "Hi, Mom. I wanted to tell you about the new contract I just signed with." "That's nice, dear. Listen, I'm actually quite busy today. Mrs. Henderson from church is coming over, and you know how she judges everything. My kitchen needs to be spotless." The words hit me like they always did, a small paper cut that somehow managed to reach bone. Even my biggest professional victories were reduced to background noise in the symphony of her daily concerns. I pressed on, desperate for even a crumb of recognition. "The contract is worth 6 figures, Mom. It's the biggest deal I've ever landed." A pause. Then, well, I suppose that single quotes adequate. Though I still don't understand why you insist on working for yourself instead of getting a real job with benefits. What happens when you get sick? What about retirement? My reflection stared back at me from the apartment window, a successful businesswoman reduced to a child seeking approval. The Denver skyline stretched beyond, full of possibilities and achievements that somehow felt hollow when filtered through my mother's perpetual disappointment. "I have to go, Sarah. Mrs. Henderson will be here soon." The line went dead, leaving me alone with the familiar ache. 30 years old, and I was still that little girl in pigtails, desperately trying to color inside the lines perfectly enough to earn a smile that never came. I walked to my home office, surrounded by awards, client testimonials, and photos from successful campaign launches. Each achievement felt like a letter written to someone who would never read it. My business partner Marcus had often joked that I worked like someone trying to prove something. He had no idea how right he was. The afternoon brought a productive client meeting downtown. But even as I presented our latest campaign strategy to a room full of impressed executives, part of me was already crafting how I'd tell Mom about this. Success. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this achievement would finally be enough. As I drove home through Denver's bustling streets, past the mix of old brick buildings and gleaming new developments that made the city feel like a place where reinvention was possible, I allowed myself a moment of hope. Tonight I'd call her again. Tonight I'd find the right words to make her see me, really see me for who I had become. But deep down, in a place I rarely let my thoughts wander, I knew the truth. No achievement would ever be enough, because the problem wasn't what I had accomplished. The problem was that I was looking for love in a place where it had never existed. 3 weeks later, I stood in the middle of my mother's pristine kitchen in suburban Minneapolis, surrounded by the suffocating perfection she'd maintained for decades. The house hadn't changed since my childhood, every surface gleaming, every decoration precisely placed, every corner radiating the kind of sterile control that had shaped my entire understanding of what love was supposed to look like. I'd driven 12 hours straight to surprise her for her birthday. My car loaded with carefully chosen gifts and a heart full of that eternal foolish hope. The orchid arrangement alone had cost $300, her favorite flowers in the exact shade of purple she'd mentioned admiring at the botanical garden last spring. "You drove all this way without calling?" she asked, not moving from her position by the granite counter. Her tone carried that familiar edge of irritation, as if my presence was an inconvenience rather than a gift. "I wanted to surprise you, Mom. It's your 60th birthday." I gestured toward the gifts I'd arranged on her dining table, each one wrapped in the expensive paper she preferred, with the silk ribbons she'd once mentioned liking. She glanced at the presents with the same expression she might give to junk mail. "I told you on the phone last month that I didn't want any fuss this year. Why don't you ever listen?" The words stung, but I pushed forward. This was how it always went: initial resistance, then gradual warming. I just had to be patient. Understanding. Perfect. I also wanted to tell you about the expansion, I said, pulling out my phone to show her the photos. I'm opening a second location in Boulder. The lease is signed, and I've already hired 3 new employees. It's everything we talked about when I first started the business. Had we talked about it? I couldn't actually remember her ever expressing interest in my business growth, but hope has a way of rewriting history. She barely glanced at the photos. More overhead, more stress, more ways for things to go wrong. I don't know why you insist on making everything so complicated. I felt that familiar crack starting in my chest, the one that had been growing wider with each conversation, each visit, each moment of watching her face remain unmoved by my attempts to make her proud. Mom, I've built something real here. I have 23 employees now, and we're profitable every quarter. I'm finally doing what I always dreamed of, what you always dreamed of. Her voice rose, sharp enough to cut glass. Sarah, you've spent your entire adult life chasing some fantasy of being important. Look at you, 30 years old, no husband, no children, no real stability. You think running around playing businesswoman makes you successful? The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in like they had when I was 16, and she'd torn down my college acceptance letters, calling them participation trophies for mediocre students. I am successful, Mom. By any reasonable measure, reasonable? She laughed, but there was no humor in it, just a hollow, bitter sound that seemed to echo off the pristine white walls of her kitchen. The laugh lingered in the air between us, like smoke, acrid and suffocating. You want to know what's reasonable? You want to talk about what makes sense in this world? Her voice rose with each word, gaining momentum like an avalanche. Reasonable is finding a good man, a decent, hard-working man who comes home every night and doesn't make you wonder where you stand. Reasonable is settling down, planting roots somewhere that matters, having a family that depends on you, that needs you for something more than a monthly checking call. Reasonable is building something that lasts, something real, something tangible instead of this elaborate pretend game you're playing with your life. The words hung between us like a gauntlet thrown down. I could feel my hands beginning to tremble, a fine tremor that started in my fingertips and worked its way up through my wrists, my arms, settling deep in my chest where 30 years of carefully swallowed words lived. 30 years of diplomatic responses crafted to avoid conflict, of careful navigation around her shifting moods and unpredictable emotional weather patterns, of biting back every honest reaction I'd ever wanted to have. All of it was crystallizing into something I'd never allowed myself the dangerous luxury of feeling. Pure, undiluted anger. It was foreign and familiar at once, this rage that had been building pressure behind the dam of my dutiful daughter performance. This isn't a game, Mom. My voice came out steadier than I felt, but I could hear the tremor underneath, the fault line beginning to crack. This is my life. This is what I've worked for, what I've built from nothing, what you've what? She cut me off with surgical precision, her eyes narrowing into something cold and calculating. They were colder than I'd ever seen them, colder than the Minnesota winter outside, like looking into the heart of a glacier. What you've sacrificed everything meaningful for. What you've chosen over having a real family, real relationships, a real life. What you've traded your soul for. The crack in my chest, the one that had been there for years, carefully patched and repatched with good intentions and forced smiles split wide open with an almost audible snap. I could feel something essential bleeding out of me, something I couldn't name but knew I'd never get back. A real life? The words tore out of me with more force than I'd intended, and I saw her eyes widen slightly at the unfamiliar sound of my voice raised in anger. Mom, I call you every single week. Every Sunday at 2 o'clock, like clockwork, no matter where I am, no matter what meetings I'm canceling or flights I'm catching. I visit every month, sometimes twice when I can manage it, driving 4 hours. Each way just to sit in this kitchen and listen to you tell me everything I'm doing wrong. I send flowers on every holiday, not just Mother's Day and your birthday, but Valentine's Day and Easter and the anniversary of Dad's death. I remember every anniversary you've ever mentioned in passing, every friend's birthday, every doctor's appointment, every small crisis or triumph in your life. I've spent my entire adult life trying to be the daughter you wanted, bending myself into shapes that don't fit, and nothing I do is ever enough. The daughter I wanted? She stepped closer, and I could see something dangerous flickering in her expression, something I'd glimpsed before but never fully recognized. It was contempt, pure and simple, wrapped in the familiar packaging of maternal disappointment. The daughter I wanted wouldn't have spent the last decade being selfish, putting her career before the people who raised her, choosing money and success over meaningful relationships, over the things that actually matter in this world. Selfish. The word came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of every sacrifice I'd made, every choice I'd second-guessed. Every moment I'd wondered if I was somehow fundamentally broken for wanting more than what this town had to offer. I've given you everything, my time, my energy, my guilt, my constant worry about whether I'm disappointing you. You've given me nothing. The words exploded out of her with a force that made me physically step backward, my hip bumping against the kitchen island with its granite countertops that she'd spent 3 months choosing the perfect shade of. Nothing but disappointment. Nothing but years of watching my daughter turn into someone I don't recognize. Nothing but the constant reminder that I raised a daughter who cares more about impressing strangers in boardrooms than taking care of the people who actually matter, who were there for her when no one else was. The kitchen fell into a silence so complete I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the antique clock on the wall, the sound of my own heart breaking in real time. It was a physical sensation, that breaking, not the metaphorical heartbreak of songs and movies, but something tangible and devastating, like feeling your ribs crack inward. Mom, please. I reached out one hand, a gesture of reconciliation, of desperate hope that we could somehow step back from this precipice we'd created. You know what, Sarah? Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried more venom than any scream could have. The quiet made it worse, made it deliberate, made it impossible to dismiss as something said in the heat of anger. Sometimes I really look at you, with your expensive clothes, and your perfectly styled hair and your smartphone that never stops, buzzing with messages from people who only know the version of you that you perform for them. And I think, you're not my daughter. My daughter would have priorities that make sense. My daughter would understand what family means, what loyalty looks like, what it means to honor the people who sacrificed everything to give her the opportunities she's wasting. But you're just a stranger wearing her face, speaking her words, but completely hollow inside. The words hit me like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at the places where I was most vulnerable, most uncertain about who I'd become and whether it was worth the cost. The kitchen tilted around me, the perfect countertops and matching appliances she'd saved for years to buy, blurring through the sudden sting of tears I'd been holding back for what felt like decades. You don't mean that. Even as I said it, I knew she did. I could hear the truth of it in her voice, see it in the set of her shoulders, in the way she was looking at me like I was something distasteful she'd found stuck to her shoe. Don't I? She was staring at me with a look of such pure disgust that I felt something inside me die, not just hurt, but actually die. Some fundamental belief I'd carried about love and family and what connected us to the people who were supposed to know us best. Get out. Take your expensive gifts that you think can buy forgiveness, and your business success that you wave around like it means something, and your selfish little life that you've built on the backs of people who actually understand what matters, and get out of my house. Get out and don't come back until you figure out who you really are underneath all that performance. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, frozen in the wreckage of everything I'd believed about our relationship, about myself, about what love was supposed to look like between mothers and daughters. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 30 years of misunderstandings and unmet expectations, until somehow, I'm still not sure how, my legs remembered how to move and carried me toward the door. I didn't take the gifts. I left them there on her perfect dining table with its matching chairs and seasonal centerpiece. $300 worth of orchids I'd chosen because I remembered her mentioning how beautiful they were in some magazine. Already starting to wilt in the artificial light of her artificial life, the drive back to Denver passed in a blur of highway lights and darkened farmland, punctuated by stops at rest areas where I sat in my car in empty parking lots, crying until I couldn't breathe, until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen shut. Each time I stopped, it felt like I was peeling off another layer of expectation, of shame, of the desperate hope that this time things might be different. The silence on the road became a kind of companion, a witness to my unraveling. The radio stayed off. Even music felt like too invasive, too emotional. I needed the hum of tires on asphalt and the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat to keep me grounded. Each mile that passed between me and that kitchen felt like shedding skin, like molting something I'd outgrown but hadn't realized I was still carrying. I thought of the look in her eyes when she screamed, "You're not my daughter." The way her voice had vibrated with something deeper than anger. Disgust? Resentment? Or maybe just fear, the fear of losing control. I replayed that moment over and over again, the words echoing like a curse, but instead of reattaching to me like they always had, they began to fade, to lose power. Maybe for the first time, I truly heard them for what they were. Her pain, not my identity. By the time I reached my apartment, my sanctuary with its clean lines and carefully chosen art, its silence that was peaceful rather than accusatory, something fundamental had shifted inside me. I stood in the doorway for a long time, my suitcase still in hand, the lights off, letting the quiet wash over me. No sharp tones, no tight smiles, no walking on eggshells, just space. Just me. The daughter who had driven to Minneapolis that morning, full of hope and carefully wrapped gifts, was gone. She had left herself behind somewhere between the second rest stop and the final apology she'd never give again. The woman who walked through my front door was someone else entirely, someone quieter but steadier. Someone who finally understood that some forms of love are actually elaborate forms of self-destruction, carefully disguised as duty or tradition or family. And that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in your own diminishment any longer. Not out of bitterness, not even out of anger, but out of a desire to live a life that is whole, not haunted. 6 weeks passed in a strange kind of peace I'd never experienced before, a silence so profound it felt almost physical, like stepping into a soundproof room after years of living next to a construction site. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't crafting phone calls to my mother in my head, rehearsing conversations that would never go the way I imagined them. I wasn't analyzing her moods like a meteorologist tracking storm systems, searching for safe windows to approach her with news of my life. I wasn't translating her criticisms into some twisted form of caring, performing the exhausting mental gymnastics required to find love in her disapproval. The silence was terrifying and liberating, in equal measure terrifying because it left me alone with thoughts I'd been drowning out for decades, liberating because those thoughts, it turned out, were kinder than anything she'd ever said to me. My business partner Marcus noticed the change immediately. Marcus Chung, 42 years old, had been my partner for 8 years and possessed the uncanny ability to read people's energy like a barometer reading atmospheric pressure. "You seem different," he said during our Monday morning meeting in our downtown Denver office, his dark eyes studying me across the polished conference table where we'd planned hundreds of marketing campaigns. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the steam rising from his perpetual cup of green tea, a ritual he'd maintained since we'd first opened our doors. Focused in a way you weren't before. It's like someone turned down the static in your head. He was right, more right than he could possibly know. Without the constant background noise of trying to make my mother proud, that exhausting, Sisyphean task that had been the soundtrack to my entire adult existence, I could finally hear my own thoughts clearly. They came in waves now, these realizations about who I actually was beneath the daughter-shaped performance I'd been giving for 30 years. The Boulder location was thriving beyond our wildest projections, bringing in clients who appreciated our authentic approach to nonprofit marketing. Our client retention was at an all-time high 93%, a number that would have made me giddy with pride just months ago. but now felt like a natural outcome of work done without the desperate need to prove my worth. I was sleeping through the night for the first time in years, no longer jolting awake at 3 a.m. with anxiety about phone calls I hadn't returned or achievements I hadn't properly celebrated for her benefit. My apartment, too, had begun to feel different. The space hadn't changed physically, same cream-colored walls, same carefully curated furniture that struck the balance between successful and not too successful that might invite her criticism, but the energy had shifted. I found myself lingering over morning coffee instead of rushing to check if she'd called. I played music while cooking dinner, something I'd unconsciously stopped doing years ago, when she'd commented that people who needed constant noise were running from something. I was running towards something now, though I couldn't yet name what it was, but the peace was fragile as spun glass, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew it wouldn't last. Peace, in my experience, was always temporary, a brief intermission between acts of a play I never auditioned for but somehow kept performing. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing marketing campaigns for the Denver Community Food Bank, one of our favorite nonprofit clients. I was deep in analysis of their social media engagement rates, genuinely excited by the 15% increase we'd achieved through more authentic storytelling, when my phone buzzed against the mahogany desk my father had made for me before he died. The phone displayed "Mom" in those stark white letters that had induced Pavlovian anxiety responses for more years than I cared to count. For a moment that stretched like taffy, I just stared at it, my finger hovering over the decline button like a hesitant pianist above an uncertain chord. Part of me wanted to let it ring forever, to maintain the blessed quiet I'd found in her absence, to protect this fragile new version of myself that had emerged in the silence like a plant, finally reaching sunlight after years in shadow. But 30 years of conditioning don't disappear in 6 weeks. 30 years of Sarah, why didn't you answer when I called? And I suppose you're too important now to talk to your mother, and the 1,000 small ways she'd trained me to be available for her needs at the expense of my own boundaries. My finger moved almost involuntarily, muscle memory overriding conscious choice. Hello? My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, cautious and guarded in a way that would have mortified my earlier self. The Sarah who always answered the phone with enthusiastic warmth, even when she felt like she was drowning. "Sarah, honey, it's Mom." Her tone was different, softer somehow, with an unfamiliar tentativeness that set off alarm bells I was only now learning to hear. I'd learned not to trust the weather patterns of her moods over the years. The way she could go from sunny to stormy without warning, the way her rare gentle moments were often the eye of some larger hurricane. "I've been thinking about you. A lot, actually. Every day." I waited, letting the silence stretch between us like a bridge I was no longer willing to build for her. In the past, I would have rushed to fill any pause in our conversations, would have made it easy for her, would have pretended that nothing had happened, that she hadn't stood in my childhood bedroom 6 weeks ago and declared with surgical precision that I wasn't her daughter. I would have been the one to smooth things over, to minimize the damage, to restore the uneasy peace we'd always mistaken for a relationship. Now I just waited, my pen poised over the food bank's engagement metrics, my breathing deliberately steady. "I think maybe we both said some things we didn't mean," she continued, her voice carrying that particular brand of careful modulation I remembered from childhood, the tone she used when she wanted something but was trying to appear reasonable, vulnerable even. "You know how I get when I'm stressed? The church auxiliary has been absolutely demanding so much of my time lately. And Mrs. Henderson has been spreading her poisonous gossip about the pastor's wife again. I swear that woman thrives on drama. And the ladies' committee has been on my case about the fall fundraiser ... The familiar pattern was there like a well-worn groove in a record deflection wrapped in explanation, justification dressed up as vulnerability. The subtle but insistent suggestion that I should understand her circumstances and make allowances for her behavior because she was, after all, under such tremendous pressure. She painted herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control, as if her cruelty were weather rather than choice. But instead of the usual desperate relief at hearing her voice, that pathetic gratitude, I'd always felt when she deigned to speak to me after our fights, I felt something else entirely. A clarity. So sharp it was almost surgical. What do you want, Mom? The question came out flat. Without the usual padding of politeness, I wrapped around everything I said to her. A pause. Longer than comfortable, filled with the sound of her recalculating. I could practically hear the gears turning as she adjusted. Her approach? The way a salesperson might pivot when their opening pitch falls flat. Then, I want to make things right between us, sweetheart. You're my daughter, Sarah. Of course you're my daughter. I was just overwhelmed that day. You know how I get when too many things pile up at once? I didn't mean what I said. For 6 weeks, I'd replayed her words over and over like a prosecutor reviewing evidence. Each repetition carving them deeper into my memory with the precision of water wearing away stone. You're not my daughter. She'd said it with such conviction, such finality, such complete absence of doubt. Her voice had been steady, her gaze direct. There had been nothing about that moment that suggested the words were accidental or born of temporary stress. Now she was trying to rewrite history, to soften the edges of what couldn't be unsaid, to gaslight me into believing my own memory was unreliable. Okay, I said simply, my voice giving nothing away. So we're good then? I knew you'd understand. I could hear the smile in her voice now. That particular brand of relief that came when she thought she'd successfully managed a situation to her advantage. You always were such a forgiving child. So mature for your age, really. I used to tell people that Sarah never holds grudges, that she understands that people aren't perfect. Forgiving, the word landed in my chest like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of recognition through me. How many times had I been forgiving? How many cruel words had I swallowed like bitter medicine? How many dismissals had I rationalized as tough love? How many moments of emotional violence had I repackaged as complicated expressions of maternal concern? I'd been so well trained in forgiveness that I'd forgotten I had any other options, so practiced at understanding her perspective that I'd never developed my own. Actually, Mom, I don't think we are good. Another pause. This one sharper, more electric. When she spoke again, there was a new edge to her voice, the first crack in the performance. What do you mean? I mean that for 6 weeks I've been thinking about what you said. Really thinking about it, not trying to explain it away or minimize it or find excuses for it, about how I'm not your daughter. And you know what I realized? You were right. Sarah, don't be dramatic. The dismissal was automatic, reflexive. The same phrase she'd used to shut down any attempt I'd ever made to express genuine feelings that didn't align with her narrative. I'm not being dramatic. I'm being honest. For the first time in 30 years. The words came out steady and sure, surprising me with their calm certainty. A daughter is someone who's loved unconditionally. Someone whose successes are celebrated rather than minimized. Someone whose struggles are met with support rather than criticism. Someone who can call her mother and share good news without being afraid it will somehow be turned against her. I've never been that to you. I've been a project that never quite met specifications. A disappointment that you kept trying to fix. A source of frustration and embarrassment that you tolerated because society expected you to. But never a daughter, not in any way that actually matters. That's not true. But her protest lacked conviction, coming out automatic and hollow. It is true, and the strange thing is, once I stopped trying to be your daughter I stopped performing that role that was killing me slowly. I finally became myself. My business is thriving because I'm not second-guessing every decision through the filter of what might make you proud. I'm sleeping better because I'm not lying awake, replaying conversations and trying to decode hidden meanings in your silences. I'm not walking around with that constant knot in my stomach, that perpetual anxiety wondering what I did wrong this time, what invisible rule I'd violated, what ordinary human emotion or achievement or struggle I'd expressed that would somehow disappoint you. The silence stretched between us across the miles, filled with years of unspoken truths finally finding their voice, heavy with the weight of recognitions too long deferred. I could hear her breathing, shallow and controlled, the sound of someone trying to maintain composure while their carefully constructed reality crumbled around them. Sarah, I called because I love you. The words came out desperate now, stripped of their earlier calculation. No, Mom. You call because you need something. You always call when you need something. The pattern was so clear now, like a mathematical equation I'd finally learned to solve. So what is it this time? Money? Emotional labor? Someone to blame for whatever's going wrong in your life this week? When she spoke again, her voice had shed all pretense of warmth, revealing the cold pragmatism that had always lurked beneath her performances of maternal concern. Fine. Since you want to be like this, since you want to throw my love back in my face, I'll be direct. I'm having some financial difficulties. The roof needs extensive repairs. The contractor says it's going to be worse than we initially thought. There's water damage in the attic, potential structural issues. And my savings aren't what they used to be after your father's medical bills. And everything else that's happened in the past few years. I thought maybe, given how well your business is doing, and I do hear things. Sarah, I know you're successful. I thought maybe you might want to help your mother in her time of need. There it was, gleaming like a blade in the artificial light of her vulnerability, the real reason for the reconciliation attempt. The soft voice, the claims of love and daughterhood. The woman who had spent 6 weeks in radio silence after disowning me was now asking for money with the same casual entitlement she might use to ask me to pass the salt. I should have felt triumphant at being right, vindicated in my suspicions. But instead I just felt tired bone deep, soul-weary, tired in the way that comes from finally seeing clearly after years of squinting through fog. How much? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be significant enough to matter. Large enough to represent a test of my supposed filial devotion. 25,000 would cover the roof and the other necessary repairs. Maybe a little. Cushion for unexpected issues. She said it casually, as if $25,000 were pocket change. As if the amount weren't more than many people made in a year, $25,000. The number sat between us like a price tag on our relationship, explicit and unambiguous. 6 months ago, hell. 6 weeks ago, I would have transferred the money without question, grateful for the opportunity to prove my worth to buy another. Few months of tenuous peace to demonstrate my value through financial utility. I would have emptied my business emergency fund if necessary. Would have taken a loan against my home if that's what it took to maintain the fiction that we had a relationship worth saving. Now I found myself calculating not just whether I could afford it. I could, though it would strain my cash flow, but whether I should. Whether enabling this pattern served anyone's interests, whether love could be measured in dollars and cents. I'll think about it, I said, the words feeling revolutionary in their simplicity. You'll think about it? Her voice sharpened with the first hint of the anger I knew was always lurking beneath the surface of her performed emotions. Like a shark fin cutting through supposedly calm waters. Sarah, I'm your mother. I raised you, sacrificed everything for you. Gave up my own dreams so you could have opportunities I never had. You raised me to be useful to you. I interrupted, cutting through the familiar litany of martyrdom she wheeled out whenever her authority was questioned. And I've been useful for 30 years. I've been the perfect emotional support system, the reliable source of validation, the convenient scapegoat when you needed someone to blame for your dissatisfaction with your own choices. But I'm done being useful at the expense of being human. The words hung in the air like smoke from a controlled burn, clearing away undergrowth that had choked the landscape for decades. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking not with the familiar fear I'd carried for so long, but with something that felt dangerously close to freedom, the intoxicating terror of jumping from a plane and trusting that the parachute would open. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking not about the money, but about the pattern, seeing it with the clarity of an archaeologist examining artifacts that told a story more complete than any single piece suggested. Every major reconciliation in our relationship had coincided with her needing something. Help with a move when her second husband left. Financial assistance when the insurance company refused to cover her cosmetic surgery. Emotional support. During her various crises that always seemed to require my dropping everything to serve as her personal therapist. I'd always told myself it was coincidence, that family helps family, that her timing was just unfortunate rather than strategic. But now I could see it clearly, like a magician's trick once you know where to look. I wasn't her daughter. I was her insurance policy, her emergency fund, her guaranteed source of supply when other sources dried up. The revelation should have hurt more than it did. Should have sent me spiraling into the kind of grief that accompanies the death of fundamental illusions. Instead, it felt like the final piece of a 1,000-piece puzzle clicking into place, making the whole picture finally make sense, transforming random scattered fragments into a coherent image I could finally understand. The relief was overwhelming, not the relief of reconciliation, but the relief of recognition, of finally seeing clearly after years of squinting through smoke and mirrors. I wasn't broken. I wasn't difficult. I wasn't the problem. I was just finally awake. The second call came exactly 1 week later, while I was in Boulder checking on our new location. The office buzzed with the energy of a successful expansion, new employees settling into their roles, their voices mixing in a symphony of productivity that I'd orchestrated from nothing. The sound of keyboards clicking, phones ringing with client inquiries, the shuffle of papers and the quiet hum of confidence that comes when a team knows they're part of something that works. It was the tangible momentum of a business that was finally hitting its stride. Like a runner finding their perfect pace after miles of struggling uphill, I was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Flatirons, those distinctive rock formations that had drawn me to Colorado in the first place. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the red sandstone, and I could see climbers moving like tiny specks against the vast canvas of stone and sky. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel genuinely proud of what I built, not just the business, but this life, this independence, this sense of belonging somewhere I'd chosen rather than somewhere I'd been assigned by birth and circumstance. The phone's ring cut through my reverie like a knife through silk, and I glanced at the screen already knowing somehow who it would be. The same number that had haunted my caller ID a week ago. My stomach clenched with that familiar mixture of dread and desperate hope that had defined my relationship with my mother for as long as I could remember. "Sarah, we need to talk." Mom's voice had shed any pretense of warmth or manipulation, any attempt at the careful dance we usually performed around each other. This was her business voice, the tone she used when negotiating with contractors who tried to overcharge her, or settling disputes at church committee meetings where she wielded her authority like a surgical instrument. It was the voice that meant she'd moved past strategy and into execution, past asking and into demanding. I pressed my free hand against the cool glass of the window, feeling the slight vibration from the wind outside. "About what?" I asked, though we both knew the answer. There was only ever one thing that prompted these calls now. "About the loan. I've thought about it, and $25,000 is actually low. The contractors found additional issues with the foundation structural problems that run deeper than we initially thought. The whole east wall needs to be reinforced, and there's water damage that extends into the basement. I need $40,000. The number hung in the air between us, like a challenge. I leaned against the window, watching people walk along Pearl Street below, living their lives with an ease that seemed almost foreign to me now. A couple shared an ice cream cone, laughing when it dripped onto the woman's shirt. A businessman walked past, checking his phone but not frantically. Not with the desperate urgency that seemed to characterize all my interactions with the outside world. Children ran ahead of their parents, secure in the knowledge that they were loved unconditionally, that their value wasn't measured in dollars or utility or how quickly they could solve someone else's crisis. These people were making their own choices. I realized, free from the weight of impossible expectations, free from the constant calculation of what they owed and to whom and why. "And if I say no?" I asked, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. In the reflection of the window, I could see my employees behind me, working steadily, trusting that I would handle whatever this call was about so they could focus on their own responsibilities. They had faith in my leadership, these people who barely knew me but who had chosen to tie their professional futures to my vision. It was a trust I'd earned, not inherited or demanded. "Then I guess you'll have shown me exactly what kind of person you really are." The threat was subtle but clear, wrapped in the familiar language of disappointment that had shaped my childhood. Pay up or lose whatever tenuous connection we still had. It was the same emotional extortion she'd used my entire life, dressed up in different scenarios, but always carrying the same message. Prove your love through compliance. Demonstrate your worth through sacrifice. Show me you care by giving me what I want regardless of what it costs you. I closed my eyes and could suddenly see myself at 8 years old, standing in our kitchen in Minneapolis. Tears streaming down my face because I'd accidentally broken one of her good plates while trying to help with the dishes. I guess this shows me how much you really care about our nice things, she'd said, her voice carrying that same tone of wounded authority. I guess I know now whether I can count on you to be careful. Mom, can I ask you something? The words came out before I'd consciously decided to speak them, but once they were in the air, I knew I needed to follow them to their conclusion. A pause. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her recalibrating, trying to determine if this was a trap or an opportunity. What? In 30 years, can you name one time, just one, when you celebrated something I accomplished without qualifying it with criticism or comparison? The question surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise her. I hadn't planned it, but standing there in my successful office, looking out at the life I'd built with my own hands, I realized it was the question that had been waiting inside me for decades, growing heavier each time I swallowed it down. What does that have to do with anything? Her voice carried a note of irritation, the sound of someone who'd been asked to deviate from a script they'd memorized years ago. It has to do with everything. Because I've been thinking about our relationship, really thinking about it since. You told me I wasn't your daughter, and I realize I can't remember a single moment when you seemed genuinely happy for me. Not when I graduated college summa cum laude, not when I started my business and landed my first major client in the same week, not when I bought my first house, that little craftsman in Denver that I was so proud of, not when I landed the Morrison account, the one that changed everything for my company. There was always something wrong, something I should have done differently, something that diminished whatever small victory I thought I'd earned. I could feel the words pouring out of me like water from a broken dam, 30 years of careful silence finally giving way. Behind me, I heard one of my employees answer a phone call with genuine enthusiasm, celebrating a new client signature. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Strangers were more excited about my successes than my own mother had ever been. Life isn't about constant celebration. Sarah, I was trying to teach you. Her voice had that patient, condescending quality. I remembered from childhood the tone of an adult explaining obvious truths to a child too naive to understand them. What? What were you trying to teach me? That nothing I do will ever be enough. That love is conditional on performance? That my value as a person depends on how useful I am to other people? That success is just another opportunity for disappointment, if you look at it from the right angle. The memories flooded back as I spoke. Graduation day, when she'd spent the entire ceremony pointing out other students who had graduated with higher honors. The day I'd closed my first major deal, when she'd asked why I couldn't find a nice man to marry instead of playing at business. The housewarming party I'd thrown when I bought my first place, where she'd spent the evening commenting on how small the rooms were and how the neighborhood wasn't as nice as where my cousin lived. I was trying to teach you resilience, responsibility. She was grasping now, falling back on the familiar justifications that had never quite made sense but had always been accepted because questioning them felt too dangerous. You were teaching me to hate myself. The words hung in the air between us, carrying 30 years of accumulated pain. They felt too big for the phone line, too heavy for the afternoon light streaming through my office windows. I watched a young couple walk past on the street below, laughing about something, their bodies unconsciously mirrored in the easy intimacy of people who liked each other, who enjoyed each other's company without agenda or calculation. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed like that freely, without the shadow of constant judgment, without wondering if my joy was appropriate or justified or somehow disappointing to someone else. "You're being ridiculous," she said, but there was less conviction in her voice now, like an actor who'd suddenly forgotten their lines. Am I? Mom, 6 weeks ago you told me I wasn't your daughter? You said it with complete certainty, like it was a fact you had been carrying around for years, waiting for the right moment to unveil it. You said it because I asked for time to think about lending you money, not because I said no. Just because I asked for 24 hours to consider a major financial decision. And now, 6 weeks later, you're calling me again, not to apologize for that devastating blow, not to repair the damage you did to what was left of our relationship, but to ask for even more money. Do you see how that looks from where I'm standing? I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, feeling the slight vibration of the building's ventilation system, the steady heartbeat of a structure built to last. It looks like you don't see me as a daughter at all. It looks like you see me as a resource to be managed, a tool to be deployed when you need something fixed. Family helps family, Sarah. The phrase came out automatically, like a reflex, but it sounded hollow in the context of everything we just said to each other. But we're not family, remember, you made that very clear. You looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't your daughter, and you meant it in that moment. I could hear it in your voice, not anger, not temporary frustration, but certainty. Like you'd finally said something you'd been thinking for a long time. For the first time in our conversation, she was quiet for more than a few seconds. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind me, could hear traffic from the street below. Could hear one of my employees explaining a project timeline to a client with the kind of patient professionalism I'd worked hard to cultivate in my team. Life was continuing around us while we held this moment suspended, this reckoning that felt decades overdue. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, smaller somehow, though still edged with the familiar resentment that seemed to be her default setting for conversations with me. So what are you saying? You're going to abandon your mother over hurt feelings? The phrase hurt feelings hit me like a slap. As if 30 years of emotional manipulation could be dismissed as simple sensitivity, as if the systematic erosion of my self-worth was just an overreaction to normal parenting. As if telling your daughter she isn't your daughter was just a momentary lapse that should be forgotten, the moment it became inconvenient to remember. I'm saying that for 30 years I've been trying to earn something from you that was never available for purchase. I've been the perfect daughter, straight A's, scholarships, no teenage rebellion, no drugs or drinking or staying out past curfew. I've been the successful daughter building a business, buying houses, making more money than anyone in our family ever dreamed of. I've been the useful daughter, always available for emergencies, always ready to solve problems, always willing to be the one who gives more than she gets. But I've never been allowed to just be your daughter. The truth of it settled over me, like a heavy blanket. All these years I've been auditioning for a role that didn't exist, preparing for a test that couldn't be passed, trying to solve an equation with no solution. That's not true, she began, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. It is true. And the proof is this phone call. You didn't call to see how I'm doing, to ask about my business expansion, to wonder if I'm dating anyone, or if I'm happy, or if I need anything. You didn't call to talk about the weather, or to share a memory, or to rebuild our relationship after you devastated it 6 weeks ago. You called because you need $40,000. And when I asked for time to think about $25,000, you didn't respect that boundary, you escalated. You called back asking for more, with a timeline that doesn't allow for my consideration, or my circumstances, or my feelings about any of this. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, could almost feel her calculating her next move, weighing her options like a chess player staring at a board that had suddenly shifted in unexpected ways. This was the game we'd been playing my entire life, and I was finally seeing it clearly, not as a relationship between mother and daughter, but as a series of transactions between someone who needed things and someone who could provide them. So, you're going to let me lose my house over money that means nothing to you? The manipulation was so transparent now, so clearly designed to make me feel guilty for having boundaries, for having needs of my own, for treating my hard-earned money as mine to decide about. She knew exactly how much I made, knew that $40,000 wouldn't bankrupt me, and she was using that knowledge as a weapon against my autonomy. I'm not going to let you do anything, Mom. You're an adult who makes her own choices. You chose to take out loans you couldn't afford. Chose to delay maintenance on your house until small problems became big ones. Chose to call me for money. Instead of exploring other options or asking other family members or seeking help from the community resources that exist for exactly these situations. But I'm also an adult, and I get to make my own choices about how I spend my money and my emotional energy. And your choice is to be selfish. There it was, the word that had haunted me since childhood. The accusation that had shaped every major decision of my adult life. Selfish for wanting to go to college out of state. Selfish for starting my own business instead of getting a stable job. Selfish for moving to Colorado. Selfish for not calling more often, for not visiting more often, for not being more available, more grateful, more compliant. My choice is to be honest. For the first time in 30 years, to be completely honest with both of us. I took a deep breath, looking out at the mountains that had become my home, at the city where I'd built something real and meaningful with my own hands, where I'd learned that I could trust my own judgment, where I'd discovered that success felt different when it wasn't filtered through someone else's expectations or disappointments. I will give you the $25,000 for the roof repairs. I'll transfer it this afternoon. But I have conditions. Conditions? The word came out sharp with surprise and indignation, as if the very concept of my having requirements was offensive to her. This is the last time. The last bailout, the last emergency fund. The last time you get to call me only when you need something fixed, or paid for, or solved. After this, if you want a relationship with me, it has to be an actual relationship, not a transaction, not a service arrangement. Not an insurance policy you can cash in whenever life gets difficult. You can't just... I can. I'm done being your emotional ATM. I'm done earning love through utility. I'm done pretending that your need for money equals my obligation to provide it, that your problems automatically become my emergencies, that your inability to plan financially somehow creates a moral imperative for me to rescue you from the consequences of your choices. The words felt like weights lifting off my chest as I spoke them, like I was finally exhaling air I'd been holding for decades. Around me, my office continued its steady hum of productivity and purpose, a reminder that there were other ways to live, other ways to relate to people, other ways to measure worth and value and love. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up, if this conversation had finally pushed us past the point where we could pretend there was something salvageable between us. 25,000, she said finally, her voice flat and businesslike.
Today?
No acknowledgement of what I'd said. No engagement with the emotional content of our conversation. No curiosity about what this ultimatum might mean for our future. Just confirmation of the transaction, acceptance of the terms that would get her what she needed in the immediate term. Today, and Mom, what? The next time you see my number on your phone, or the next time you think about calling me, ask yourself if you're calling because you miss me or because you need something. Because I'll be able to tell the difference now. I've learned to recognize the difference between being needed and being loved, between being useful and being valued. After I hung up, I sat in my Boulder office for a long time, watching the afternoon light shift across the mountains, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and amber that seemed to change even as I watched. The Flatirons looked different now, not just beautiful, but protective somehow, like sentinels guarding this new life I built so far from the complications of my childhood. The transfer took less than 5 minutes, a few clicks on my banking app, a security code, a confirmation screen, and $25,000 moved from my account to hers. The money that represented months of work, dozens of client meetings, countless hours of strategic planning and careful execution, reduced to a digital transaction that would be forgotten by tomorrow. It should have felt like a loss, like being robbed or cheated, but instead it felt like the most expensive boundary I'd ever purchased. $25,000 for the right to never have this conversation again. Marcus found me there an hour later, still staring out the window, still processing what had just happened and what it meant for the rest of my life. "Everything okay?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk with the easy familiarity of someone who'd worked beside me through the challenges of building something from nothing. "I just bought my freedom," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, how final the statement felt. "It cost $25,000, but I finally bought my freedom." He didn't ask what I meant, and I didn't explain. Some victories are too personal for sharing, too hard-won for casual conversation, too complicated to reduce to simple explanations. He just nodded and updated me on the day's progress, treating me like someone whose judgment he trusted, whose leadership he respected, whose value wasn't contingent on my utility to others. That night, I called my therapist, something I'd been putting off for months while I poured all my emotional energy into the black hole of my mother's approval. While I tried to solve problems that weren't mine to solve and heal wounds that weren't mine to heal. "Dr. Martinez? This is Sarah Chan. I know it's been a while, but I'd like to schedule an appointment. Something significant has happened, and I think I need help processing it." Her voice was warm with recognition and professional concern. Of course, Sarah. How about Thursday at 3? And Sarah? I'm glad you called. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we put off the longest. Then I called my friend Jessica, whom I'd been neglecting while I focused all my emotional bandwidth on managing my relationship with my mother. While I tried to be available for crises that never seemed to end, while I convinced myself that other friendships were luxuries I couldn't afford when family needed so much attention. "Sarah, I was just thinking about you. How are you?" The question was simple, but it hit me like a revelation. When was the last time someone had asked how I was without wanting something in return? When was the last time I'd been asked that question? By someone who actually cared about the answer, who had time to listen to whatever response I might give. "I'm different," I said, settling into my couch with a cup of tea, feeling the tension leave my shoulders for the first time in weeks. "Better, I think. Definitely different." We talked for 2 hours about my business expansion and her new relationship, about our shared memories from college and our dreams for the future, about books we'd read and movies we'd loved and plans we wanted to make. It was the kind of conversation I'd forgotten was possible, one where I didn't have to perform or prove anything, where my successes were celebrated without qualification and my struggles met with genuine sympathy rather than judgment or advice. About how I could have avoided them if I'd made different choices. Jessica laughed at my stories and asked follow-up questions that showed she was actually listening. She remembered details from conversations we'd had months ago and wanted to know how various situations had resolved. She treated me like someone worth knowing for reasons that had nothing to do with what I could provide or fix or solve.
"I've
missed you," she said as we were winding down the call. "I know you've been dealing with family stuff, but I hope we can do this more often. You sound lighter somehow." 3 days later, I opened an email from my mother. No subject line, just 8 words in the message body. "Thank you for the money. The roof is fixed." 8 words to acknowledge a $25,000 transfer. 8 words to close the book on a conversation that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of our relationship. No acknowledgement of what we'd discussed. No reflection on the conditions I'd set. No curiosity about how I was doing or what this transaction had cost me emotionally. Just a simple confirmation that the money had served its purpose, that the problem had been solved, that the crisis had passed until the next one emerged. I stared at the screen for a long moment, remembering all the times I'd crafted careful responses to her brief communications, trying to read meaning into her sparse words, hoping to find some opening for connection or warmth or genuine relationship. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 weeks ago, who would have read volumes into those 8 words, who would have responded with enthusiasm and questions and offers of future help. I deleted the email without responding. For 30 years.
I'd
been trying to solve an equation that had no solution, trying to earn love from someone who saw love as a commodity rather than a gift, who measured relationships in terms of utility rather than joy, who couldn't separate being needed from being valued. But I wasn't that person anymore. I was someone who knew the difference between being loved and being used, between being cherished and being convenient, Between being a daughter and being a resource. The woman who had driven to Minneapolis 6 weeks ago would have read hope into that brief email, would have crafted a response designed to keep the conversation going, to bridge the gap, to maintain the connection at any cost. She would have thanked her mother for the acknowledgement, asked about the contractors, offered help with future maintenance issues, done anything to keep the door open for a relationship that had never existed in the form she'd imagined. The woman. I'd become simply closed her laptop and went back to living her life, the one she'd built with her own hands, the one that belonged entirely to her, the one where her worth wasn't contingent on her usefulness to others. 6 months later, my phone would ring again. The number would be familiar, the need would be urgent, the expectation would be automatic. Mom would need something else, maybe money, maybe emotional support, maybe just the familiar comfort of having someone to disappoint, someone whose boundaries could be tested, someone whose love could be measured in dollars and immediate availability. But when that call came, it would ring through to voicemail. Because I'd finally learned the most important lesson of my life. Some relationships aren't meant to be repaired. Some are meant to be released so that the people involved can finally become who they were always meant to be. So that love can find space to grow in the places where manipulation once flourished. So that genuine connection can replace transactional exchanges. The daughter my mother wanted had never existed, that perfectly compliant, endlessly available, eternally grateful person who would absorb disappointment and criticism without complaint, who would provide resources without conditions, who would measure her own worth by her utility to others. That daughter was a fiction, a role I'd been trying unsuccessfully to play for 3 decades, but the woman I'd become in her absence was someone. I was finally proud to know, someone who could build businesses and maintain friendships, someone who could set boundaries and honor them, someone who understood that love given freely was infinitely more valuable than love extracted through guilt and manipulation. Standing in my Boulder office, looking out at the mountains that had become my sanctuary, I realized I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not perfect, not without flaws or challenges or areas for growth, but authentically myself in a way that felt revolutionary after so many years of performing someone else's expectations for the first time in my adult life. I was enough. Not because I'd finally achieved some impossible standard, but because I'd stopped trying to. Not because I'd earned the right to be valued, but because I'd recognized that value wasn't something that could be earned or lost based on performance. I was enough because I existed, because I tried, because I cared about people and treated them well and built things that mattered. I was enough because I'd learned to separate love from transaction, worth from utility, relationship from service. The mountains outside my window seemed to nod in approval, ancient and permanent and unconcerned with human drama, but somehow blessing. This small moment of clarity, this hard-won peace, this expensive freedom that had cost exactly $25,000 and 30 years of confused searching for something that had been inside me all along.